Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce this webinar today on infected globalization in search of a new normal. Uh, we have today a very good group of panelists discussing this topic with us this afternoon. We have Eric Jones, Director of the European and Eurasian Studies at SAIS of Johns Hopkins University. We have Maria De Mertis, Deputy Director at Bruegel, think tank in Brussels. We have Homi Karasa, which is Interim Vice President and Director of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institutions in Washington. And we have Mabel Miao Liu, who's co-founder and vice president of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing. Thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon and for discussing this very relevant topic. Everybody has been talking for the past 2 or 3 months about many of the problems that the current pandemic and the diffusion of the coronavirus has spread around in many countries in the world. And of course, we know that the biggest impact is in terms of human lives, and the toll has been really high and heavy. But unfortunately, there are other less direct effects of the virus, which have to do with the economic effects related directly to the impact of the virus and to how countries tried to deal with the problem by closing down their economies to different extents. Now, in addition to the direct economic consequences of the lockdown, we see that for many countries, there are travel restrictions in place, there are limitations to international exchanges. It's difficult to deal with the normal organization of global value chains in many countries. There are disruption in supplies, etc., etc. So one of the important points of the current discussion is whether one of the victims of the virus is going to be the globalization process as we know it. Right? We know that globalization has been one of the buzzwords for many years now, for over 20 years, I would say, at least since the beginning of the current millennium. And globalization has been experienced by many people as an inevitable phenomenon, something that was increasing and going on more or less automatically. Now, the current situation is really testing this perception of globalization. Is globalization going to continue as we used to see it? Is it going to change? Is it going to stop? And how are the international institutions and the different countries dealing with the consequences on globalization that this pandemic is carrying around? So these are the topics that we want to discuss today. Will we see a different type of globalization tomorrow, a different type of world tomorrow as a consequence of what we have been experiencing in the past months and we are still experiencing now? So these are the issues we will discuss this afternoon. And let me start with Professor Eric Jones. So we know, Eric, that the current pandemic is having a very strong effect on the economies of the largest countries in the world. So what's your opinion on which are the most important effects? Are they economic, political? Which type of effects? And how are the countries dealing with the non-strictly health effects of the pandemic? Eric, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lucia, and thank you all for having me on this panel. I think we should try to break this up into three different attributes for three different groups of countries. So we'll talk about China, we'll talk about Europe, and we'll talk about the United States, and then we'll look at them in terms of perceptions, the way they're connected to the outside world, and what we think they're going to do in terms of their policy action. Let's talk about perception. Obviously, the perception of China has evolved quite considerably across this crisis. Initially, China was perceived to be very secretive and not effective in responding to the crisis. And over time, perceptions of effectiveness have tended to improve. And now we have a very strong sense, not only that China has a sort of more effective control over what's going on in its country, but we're seeing that exercise of control extending beyond the sort of typical boundaries that we would associate it with, and we'll get back to that in a minute. The European situation, by contrast, was marked by the significant divisions within Europe, not divisions initially in terms of policy, but divisions in terms of the way the pandemic spread across European Union member states. But eventually those policy divisions did emerge, and there have been important discussions that will culminate in one instance, at least tomorrow, with the European Commission's proposal for a recovery fund. But there have been important discussions about the nature of European integration and the extent to which it extends to include financial solidarity. And that perception of division, I think, is going to be a lasting one after this crisis, unless, of course, it changes quite substantially in the context of the proposals that they're debating at the moment. In the United States, it's not so much decisiveness or division as distraction. I think when people look at the United States now, they're struck by the extent to which the US government seems to be so distracted from the real issues of the day, and the federal system seems so incapable of generating any kind of a policy focus. And I think that's an unusual face for foreigners to see when they look at the United States, and telling in many respects for how the United States is likely to engage with the world, which brings me to that second attribute, the connections. I think China is going to try to emphasize its role in global value chains and try to emphasize the importance that China offers to the world as a workshop, a manufacturing powerhouse that needs to be integrated. But I'm not quite sure that that message is going to be received all that well in Europe. So, for example, if you were to look at the Franco-German agreement that offers the best prospect for financial solidarity, you'll find that 3/4 of that agreement have to do with restoring what they call sovereignty over health and health industries, the reassertion of strategic autonomy in terms of environment and digital technologies, and crucially, the reshoring of significant chunks of value chains to make sure that Europe is more resilient in the face of this kind of shock going into the future. And implicitly, that means cutting out both China and the United States to a certain extent from traditional relations. And in the United States, I think we're going to see that even much more strongly. No matter who wins the elections that will take place in November, there'll be a big emphasis on industrial policy, I think, in the American context, because what we are seeing in the US case is the extent to which non-manufacturing workers and the non-manufacturing side of the economy are so vulnerable to this kind of crisis, and the people involved in that part of the economy are so unprepared. So,
Eric, just a point I wanted to ask you, as you mentioned it quickly, how relevant is in the U.S. Current attitude in the crisis the fact that we are in an election year, a very important election year, by the way? What do you think?
I think obviously it's extremely relevant. It's extremely relevant because of the economic consequences of the crisis. But you could imagine under a different president or under a president who responded much more quickly to this, that being in an election year would be almost a non-issue, right? If we had had a president who had insulated the United States from the get-go, the bump that president would have received in terms of public opinion approval ratings would have been significant, and that would have carried them through the election, that on the back of what was already relatively strong U.S. economic performance. So I think it's really the election is only important because the crisis is being handled so badly. And in that sense, I think the level of distraction plays into the political calculus. I mean, I just to finish my train of thought from the beginning, I think we're going to see a much more outward-looking China than we've seen in the past, which is interesting, given how much China has been engaged in an outward-looking phase. But it's going to be even more outward-looking. I think we're going to still see an inward-looking Europe. I don't see that changing, despite all the rhetoric about sovereignty and strategic autonomy. What's really going to change is we're going to see a much more inward-looking United States. And in that sense, I think the global governance issues will be put under stress because of American withdrawal from the traditional role that it used to play. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Very interesting remarks. Now, we know, and this was already mentioned, that to deal with the effects of the crisis, governments in Europe and elsewhere started to spend huge amounts of money to try to sustain incomes, to help industries. There are discussions, as Eric mentioned, of new industrial policies. And of course, industrial policies very often are costly. Sustaining income, sustaining the health system is costly. So we face a situation in which many governments are rapidly increasing the level of their deficits, and public debt is rapidly piling up in a number of countries, including those that are used to be very, very conservative in that respect. For example, Germany. So Maria, can you elaborate a bit on that? What do you think will be the financial consequences of the current pandemic?
Thank you very much, Lucia, and thank you very much for hosting us. I've looked very much forward to a discussion. Thank you also, Eric, for your initial remarks. They were very inspiring, actually. It's interesting to hear your view on the US. We are looking in Europe at the US very attentively to see what the relationship will evolve after the elections. But I mean, to come back to your question, you started by saying that what will the new normal look like after the pandemic? Is it going to be a globalization reverse? Is it going to be economic catastrophe? I mean, it's difficult to look into a magic ball and answer this question, but I think it's fair to say that the economic effects are, first of all, the most immediate ones, and therefore greatly felt, and they are unprecedented. I mean, back 10 years ago, we were talking about the financial crisis being once in a year, economic crisis. Here we are 10 years later, and we're still talking about a once in a lifetime crisis in economic terms. Only this time it is in the real economy. It's not just in the financial sector, and therefore it's affecting all of us. The reaction has been different, as Eric has suggested, but effectively at one point or other, where all the countries have put their economy in a standstill. I call this an artificial coma, the mother of all shutdowns, which effectively means that we are very much basically surviving on very little economic activity. The estimates here, for example, in Belgium had been that at the beginning of the shutdown, the economy was functioning at 70%. I actually think this is quite a big amount, but effectively it was an immediate stop of the economy, unprecedented, in unprecedented terms. And as you said, Lucia, one way of helping those who have been affected immediately, either through loss of job or through loss of income one way or another, have been to basically for the government to step in. And what we actually find ourselves now is the role of the state has increased unprecedentedly. And, we are hoping that this is going to be only temporary or for a small amount of time, but it is effectively an unprecedented role of the state, of the likes that we haven't seen in generations, I think. And that, of course, is financed through debt. So the first economic action that we have seen is that everybody has gone across the world. All countries, all governments have gone to the markets to finance first the health needs and then the economic needs. And that, of course, has meant that we're going to have a double whammy effect on the debt, because both the numerator will increase by the amounts borrowed, but also the denominator effect, because you have the GDP that will be shrinking. And if you follow the forecast in rather dire numbers. So we're going to have a level of debt by the end of this that is going to be substantially bigger than what it was when we started with. And then, of course, that will mean something for all of us. It would certainly mean something for those countries that started from a weak position to begin with. And that, of course, is something that is beginning to look like an important risk in the recovery phase. How will countries that have not had a very good debt position to begin with, how will they favor by the end of all of this? And what will that mean? Now, part of this debt that has been issued by the different governments has been absorbed, certainly in the developed world, by the central banks. The central banks have gone in massively into the markets, and they have bought the majority of this new debt, which means that the balance sheet of the central banks have increased numberfold. Now, this is good news for the government because it means that the markets will not be excluding any country from the markets themselves. However, it means that the central bank balance sheet will look substantially different than what it looked before the pandemic, and we need to discuss what this will mean. Maybe we can do this at a different time, but for the moment, at least, governments are secured. They can access the markets massively, and they can finance their operations. Later on, when this debt begins to mature, we will have to come back and talk about central banks, talk about central bank policy, talk about independence of central banks. But this is not for the minute. This is not for now. This is for later. I personally believe this is an important discussion to have. We should not forget it. But in any case, it's an important action, and therefore it needs to happen. But I think also the private sector will come out of this more indebted. The government has gone in and finances whoever they can finance. And here I remind you that in the EU, we have temporarily removed state aid rules. State aid rules are sacrosanct in the EU for competition policy purposes, but we have removed them in order to allow for governments to come in and rescue productive activity. The trouble with that is that, first of all, it's not so easy to decide what is productive activity and what is not. So the risk here is that we are going to end up with a massive bill at the end of this. And the other thing is that some of it will be done in the form of loans, and some of it will be done in the form of grants. And exactly the composition of that is very much a part of the discussion that is going on right now. So it is very likely the case that the private sector will come out more heavily indebted. And as a result, it will have a debt burden that is going to weigh heavily on the shoulders of particularly SMEs in the EU, who are the machine of the economy. And then it remains to be seen how this will be dealt with later on. I wanted to say also something about the households, because households are also tremendously affected, primarily through the labor market, not so much through indebtedness, in particular because also certainly in the EU there have been deferrals of payments as a measure, which means that there is an alleviation of the burden, at least momentarily. But I think the households have been affected tremendously through the labor market. And I remind you that those households that are financially fragile in the EU are of the order of magnitude of 1 in 3. There are countries for which this is 1 in 2, and there are countries for which this is 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, but on average 1 in 3 households is financially fragile, meaning that its own perception is that it cannot really deal with a financial shock, and this is before the pandemic. So we're coming into the pandemic with huge debts and with financially fragile households of that order of magnitude. The state will pick it up, and good solutions are important because if countries in the euro area, for example, come into trouble after the crisis, this is going to jeopardize financial stability in the EU, it's going to jeopardize the euro, and therefore it's going to jeopardize the global economy and its global financial stability. I'll stop here, and I hope to come back in the discussion with more general comments.
Thank you very much, Maria. Very, very interesting. And I totally share your view that to solve the more urgent and current issues, definitely we are building some additional risks, and this might hamper the speed of recovery in many ways. So this is something that should definitely be monitored. And also there is another point, and let me turn to Homi Karas also for this, because in this situation in which there are multiple agents looking for money and issuing debt, the state, the firms, some households, etc., etc. It really looks like we are really in need for some sort of lender of last resort. We need some sort of multilateral institution playing some sort of insurance role in this situation, and not only from the purely financial side, I would say. In general, basic analysis would suggest that in a global crisis like the one we are going through, we would need some sort of global action or some sort of coordination. But till now, the global governance didn't seem to work very well. So what are your views on this, Homi? How did the system that we know of global governance worked during this crisis?
Well, thank you, Lucia, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think that what the crisis has really revealed is that the pillars of global governance, the multilateral institutions that were created after World War II, were really created for quite a different purpose. So if you think about the history at that time, you have organizations like the IMF that was in essence designed to ensure that we didn't have competitive devaluations again. We had organizations like the old GATT, what's now the World Trade Organization, that was essentially put in place to make sure that we didn't have such destructive tariff wars again. So these institutions were designed to stop countries from harming each other. They weren't really designed for ensuring some kind of collaborative action amongst countries. And what we're seeing right now is that we don't really have global institutions that are charged with global collective action. So perhaps the closest that we have in that regard is the G20. But the G20 is simply it's a club. It does not have the legitimacy of being a truly global organization, although obviously the countries that are part of the G20 account for 80+% of the global economy. But the G20 has, to some extent, been able to put together a reasonably coordinated set of actions, especially on the fiscal front. So if you add together what governments are doing with their central banks, they have probably now injected something like 8 to 9 trillion US dollars equivalent into the global economy, which is a very sizable amount of money. So I think that the speed with which the G20 has acted has actually been much faster than during the financial crisis, and the amounts have been commensurately larger. So there are some reasonably positive signs on that. And the G20 haven't only thought about their own economies, they've also thought to a certain degree about emerging economies. And so at the G20 meeting in April, they did decide to have a debt standstill for some of the poorest economies in the world in terms of the debt owed to official creditors. And that's a useful step forward, although, unfortunately, that did not include many middle-income countries that are vulnerable, especially small islands. It did not include treatment of private sector debt. So there are still some gaps that we see emerging in this global architecture. But I think the other positive area of global governance is the way in which science and scientific collaboration, the non-governmental part of global governance, has really come together. And whether it's scientists collaborating on the pursuit of a new vaccine, whether it's businesses starting to organize coalitions about how they would move forward in doing this. It's quite interesting to me to see that there seems to be much more momentum and much more progress on these other layers of global governance, civil society's response, business coalitions, science, rather than on government's response, where basically the rivalry between the US and China has to some extent constrained the ability of many multilateral organizations to really move forward. And that, I think, is going to be the key for a new global governance as we go forward. It's going to be to say, this is not just about how governments interact with each other. This is going to be how many different layers of global society interact with each other to solve global problems.
Homi, given what you were saying, I wanted to turn to you one of the questions from the public, which is really related to what you just said. So in the race to find quickly a vaccine for COVID-19, is a competition between countries the best way to go, or should there be cooperation across countries to obtain the vaccine? What you were saying seems to suggest that what really matters here is not cooperation at the country or government level, but cooperation across scientists or across researchers. Is that your view? So is competition dangerous in this case? What do you think?
I think that what is actually happening is that scientists are in fact sharing information much more rapidly than they ever did before. I mean, in the old situation, I would say scientists might say, oh, if I'm making some advance in one area, let me wait. I can get an early start for having an academic publication. I can further my career in this way. They would keep their information to themselves to a certain extent. But here, what I see in response to COVID is that scientists are simply saying, I want to be part of a global solution. I want to be part of the advancement of science. And one of the great things, if you will, to emerge out of this awful crisis is that I think the respect for science, the reliance on science to solve some of our big social problems has really grown. And I hope that this will continue to be the case in the area of health. But there are so many other areas as well where we face major global problems. So it's the case in carbon emissions and the move towards a low carbon economy. It's the case in land use and the need to move to a system of food security that does not have such high dependence on phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, which have already reached or are broaching planetary boundaries. So I think that there's a lot of reliance on science, and I think this is starting to pull scientists from across the world together in an understanding that they have an opportunity and an obligation to be part of a much larger global movement, rather than thinking of just their own kind of scientific, how do I get my paper published? This is actually something real that is affecting the lives of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people.
Thank you very much, Homi. Thank you. Let me turn to Mabel Mialu, and I ask her to share with us also her view on how global governance has been working in the past months. We heard that, of course, there has been some efforts to coordinate, at least at the level of the G20. But do you share this view? What do you think is happening, especially from the point of view of emerging countries? Please, Mabel.
Okay, thank you, Lucia. Thank you for introduction and for having me. And I'm really appreciate the opportunity to share my views on the impact of COVID-19 on globalization, and how could the emergency countries do. This is a really important topic, and it seems macro, but truly concerns the future of all human beings. At the very beginning, I would like to mention that actually before the pandemic outbreak, the global institutions and global governance has experienced unprecedented change since Second World War. The rise of populism and the intensive geopolitical tensions have challenged the Atlantic Chapter, which was originally laid out principles for the post-war order. And the pre-pandemic globalization was put under uncertainties, while the pandemic gave us a bigger shock. Meanwhile, it has served as a strong reminder of the importance of international solidarity, and it underscores how our globe can be and needs joint institutional support. The coronavirus has become the catalyst for the change of our global system. And then the question have been raised right now. What is the globalization going on, and will the pandemic undermine or strengthen global order? Where will the international community go? Will go a unity or division? In my view, it depends on two factors. One is how long the pandemic will last, and in which way. The second is in which way the major power will cooperate. We are seeing how global threat has transcended borders. The transnational challenges are calling for global response, while there are only paradoxical efforts, like we know many countries have the travel restrictions. Even developing vaccine is undertaken separately, independently. Like Professor Horney mentioned, the global scientist cooperation are very important for the vaccine pursuit. And the restriction of medical resources from overseas for many countries, as well as an incoming weaponized supply chain. So I would like to provide one point is that the United Nations, after 7 decades, has become stuck in a difficult situation from which it is difficult to reform the organization. The deadlock has compromised the UN's ability and deal with the current challenges, in return determining its authority. For example, the WHO, World Health Organization, the specialized agency of UN responsible for the international public health, should have been the core institution to coordinate international efforts to fight the pandemic. However, in some areas, it has lacked the power to have the unified response and mobilize global resources. What's more, right now, some now seek to use the WHO as a scapegoat on which to pin blame for the crisis. Yesterday, I know there's another webinar organized by ISPI. The topic is from the trade to the blame game. So smearing the WHO right now is prevail among some countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that is wrong against the humanitarian spirit at this very critical juncture of epidemic. I find there's a phenomenon that those have followed WHO's advice have relatively handled the COVID-19 outbreak well, while countries that ignored or rejected its advice have paid a heavy price. Secondly, I would mention that the international free trade system has been disrupted due to the pandemic with the spark of trade protectionism. Just like time after the Second World War and the 2008 economic crisis, I think trade can still serve as the key main engine for post-pandemic recovery of the world economy. That highlights the need for countries to work together to strengthen the free trade system by continuing to lower tariffs and non-tariffs barriers. And our current crisis creates the need and will reboot, reform, and finally hold the World Trade Organization into the new century. Though, like other global institutions, WTO has been weakened by years of deadlock and fought behind the reality of global integration. We should work together for WHO reform, especially encourage WTO to the protection of economies. And China right now is also supporting the WTO reform. I believe the EU and China can work together on the e-commerce cooperation on the WTO reform. And thirdly, the outbreak has exposed the fragility of the global value chain. And some of the panelists mentioned that through the globalization over the last few decades, global value chains become tie-linking countries together. Now, anti-globalization sentiment calls to reshore key productive activities. The pandemic has accelerated pressure on GVCs, but I think serious decoupling is very visible due to the deep and complex linkage and bind countries together. Shifting countries back home would incur high cost at time of economic difficulty. Nevertheless, we do need to find ways to strike a balance between costs and potential risks to ensure the GVCs are resilient, inclusive, generate wealth for all of the parties. One possible outcome is an acceleration of regional integration, which will likely become the future basis of globalization, such as RCEP or CPTPP. Those regional arrangements can resume after pandemic or later. However, the prospects of economic regionalization should not be the practice of economic separatism that may lead to complete loss of comparative advantage benefits.
Mabel, sorry, given that you mentioned potential effects on global supply chains, I wanted to pick up one of the questions that came from the audience, and I also invite after the other speakers to address this point. The question has to do on how companies will run business after this pandemic. And so, of course, especially for many large companies, being embedded in important global value chains is a major part of the way in which they run business. Do you think that there will be major changes in this respect? What is your view on how companies behave after the crisis?
Yes, this question is raised by many companies, even in China, from MNCs in China. And actually, like I mentioned, the global value chains are very complicated right now. Before the pandemic. So there's a survey in China from AmCham China, and most of the companies from US in China would like to still prefer China as the first demonstration of their investment. So I think so this is a great confidence for those MNCs to continue their business in China. Like I mentioned, if they would like to move their factory or their part of their the chains to the other country, even to ASEAN countries or the neighbors of China, still not so easy, because like China is with a great population, with well-educated and the lower price human resources, and and China is the most complicated value chain, especially in some industry chain. So I don't think it's so easy to move their factory or move their value chain out of China. So, but of course, some of them prefer to the other destination, but the other places. But I think most of them still stay in China and keep the traditional global value chain?
Thank you very much. Let me turn this question also to Eric. What do you think the big companies in US or Europe or in China, are they, do you see any signal about potential reorganization of the way in which businesses are run around the world because of the pandemic?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things when you look at supply chains and supply chain adaptation, one of the great sort of apocryphal stories came in 2011 with the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami and nuclear disaster. And what we learned then is just how fragile supply chains can be, particularly when the production of one critical component is geographically concentrated. And the adaptation to that was to build more resilient supply chains in terms of flash memory, which was the critical component in the Fukushima context. Now we're seeing the need to build more resilient supply chains with respect to a whole lot of different components. And while I agree completely that not all manufacturing is going to cease in China, that would be crazy, I think there will be efforts to relocate significant components to make sure that the supply chains are more resilient. That's going to be a very expensive project, and that's why I agree with Maria. There's going to be a lot of public sector money that's going to be spent on this as well. And you see this particularly in the European context, where they're already making provisions for that effort.
But you mentioned one thing in your first intervention, Eric, about the fact that we are going to see China much more outward oriented compared to the recent past, right? So we're talking about a more political outward orientation or a more economic outward orientation, because some people think that China has already started to shorten the length of global value chains and to reshore part of the production process in which China was previously involved. And so do you think the pandemic will accelerate that type of reorientation toward the domestic economy, or was your remark more based on the political orientation, outward orientation of China?
So it was definitely focused more on the political orientation of China. China's been engaged in a macroeconomic rebalancing exercise ever since the last global economic and financial crisis, which I say with great fanfare, but it was only 10 years ago, right? And they've been engaged in that exercise since then, and quite successfully, I might add. Also in line with the internationalization of Chinese finance and changes in the financial context within China. The political dimension of this, I think, is what we're going to see now, and the idea that China would be defending the WHO against the United States, which is what we're seeing, is something that I don't think we would have imagined 10 to 15 years ago, if you see what I mean.
Thank you very much. Maria, someone was suggesting a potential way to reduce the weight of debt, at least for some countries, by introducing different forms of taxation, in particular, some sort of wealth tax to try to finance part of the public expenditures during the crisis. Do you think this would be a solution? What's your opinion about the possibility of introducing in Europe, especially, a wealth tax especially in countries that already started in the crisis with a very high debt burden, like Italy, certainly, for instance, and Greece? Are you coming from Greece? Are you? Yes. So those are countries that were not well equipped financially to begin with. So what do you think? Would that be a potential way to go?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Lucia. Just a brief comment on Greece. Paradoxically, with the start of the pandemic, Greece was still not part of the QE because the quality of its debt is not where it needs to be. So it's not still quality investment grade, as we call it. However, the ECB acknowledged that no country should be left out from the markets and therefore granted access to QE. Greece had never had access to QE, which basically means that for 10 years now, Greece has not had an effective monetary policy to help with managing the cycle. So paradoxically, now it has. So all the money, essentially the biggest majority, if not all of the debt that Greece will issue as a result of the pandemic, will be absorbed by the central bank, and therefore the burden on the Greek debt will be of a different type than if it were just going to the markets like in any other debt. So in that respect, I think the situation in Greece isn't as problematic as you might think, and I call this paradoxically because it is true that Greece has got a huge amount of debt. But most of it, and by most of it, I certainly mean about 80 to 90%, is not marketable debt. It's in the hands of public funds. So that's so really Greece is not the Greek debt is not an issue right now. This is not true for Italy. Luckily, it's not true for Italy in the sense that Italy has not ever been shut out of the markets. But it is true that any increase of the debt will be need to be financed at some point. And how we choose to finance that debt is anybody's guess. In the European context, there is talk about different types of taxes. But I think the interesting new component here is whether we can issue debt jointly. We don't call it Corona bonds anymore. We call it something else. But I mean, the issuance of common debt in Europe is, in my view, an incredible step. If it survives, it hasn't been decided yet, but they certainly talk in this direction. And if it survives, it will be an incredible step forward. And more importantly, is how this debt will be backed up. There is talk about what we call own resources, which is effectively taxing in Europe. That is, architecturally speaking, is not quite what you see here around Hamiltonian moment for Europe. I don't believe it's a Hamiltonian moment, but it is a big moment nevertheless in the step of the direction of fiscal federation, very far from a fiscal federation, but in that direction. So issuance of common debt, and if we were to issue common taxes to finance that debt, that would be one way of financing these extra debts that we will have to incur. The time is right for common debt, and the EU would issue debt very cheaply. I mean, if it were to issue 500 billion euros worth of debt in the markets, the size of the recovery fund that the Germans and the French are supposing, and finance it through debt, it will have a burden of interest payments, which would be very, very small, something that would be very easy to finance, even with a common tax. So there had been a talk about a plastic tax in the European Union. The Commission has suggested that. If that were to go through, following European Commission estimates, that would more than finance the interest burden payments on common issue debt. So there are ways forward, there are means forward, there are tools. But of course, there needs to be political will. There needs to be political agreement that such a new tool is possible and desirable. And that is not decided yet. There will be heated discussions after tomorrow between the prime ministers on this front, and we'll see what happens. Beyond that, then, countries themselves can issue different taxes, wealth tax being one of them, very heated debate in different countries, digital tax being another one. And of course, in my view, the most important tax of them all would be the carbon tax adjustment tax. Also need to be in line with the green objectives of the new European Commission and actually of Europe and beyond Europe, other countries as well. I think this is the future. It is a difficult tax to instrumentalize, but it is an important step to recognize that the Earth is limited, and our consumption has brought the whole planet in its limits.
Thank you very much. I really agree that one of the positive side effects of the crisis could be to push Europe forward toward a closer fiscal unity to some extent. Europe has often in the past, the European Union in the past, I think, has often accelerated its path of integration precisely in crisis moments. So this might be one of them. I totally agree with your view. Homi, something that has also come up by some remarks made by Mabel, but also by Eric, is that in the global institutions, we've been observing, not only in the crisis, I must say, but also in the previous months, some change of roles between the different players. We used to think about the position of some countries in a given way, and they have been switching around their position. And especially as Eric was saying, seeing China defending the WHO against the US is somehow unexpected. And I think that this is something that has been going on already previously with WTO and with other institutions. So what do you think? Will we see a different way to manage government within the international institutions in the future, a different role for different players?
Well, I think it's been extremely difficult to engineer a reform of multilateral institutions, and one need look no further than, for example, the increase in quotas given to China at the IMF, and how slow that has been compared to China's growth in the as a share of the world economy, to see and understand how difficult it is to change power structures within international organizations. That's really what gave rise to new international organizations such as the Global Fund, when there was a new global problem of AIDS, TB, and malaria. And I think the Global Fund has been extremely successful, partly because its governance structure not only has states, but it also has beneficiaries, and it also has individuals. It has actual people, civil society. So I think that we're struggling to find new types of global governance, and we will struggle to find the right balance between reforming existing global institutions, which is extremely hard, versus creating new global institutions. Just to take a completely different problem that we have. Everybody knows that we've got a major problem with the management of the world's oceans and plastics within oceans, etc. We have no international institution that manages the high seas. Do we need one? Should we simply continue to cobble together some kind of a network where these responsibilities are allocated to existing institutions, or should we actually have a dedicated new institution? I think these are going to be some of the issues that that emerge. And you know, we've seen in the case of the IMF and the World Bank, to take the Bretton Woods institutions as an example, Asia has always been pushing their own alternatives. So now we actually have new international financial institutions in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in the New Development Bank, new institutions, multilateral institutions that in essence were designed to try to fill the gap in the provision of infrastructure finance, in particular in emerging economies. So where there are gaps, there's going to be an institutional vacuum, and you're going to see efforts to try to fill that institutional vacuum with quite different governance relationships. And as I said before, I believe that if we can move towards what's sometimes called multi-stakeholder governance, we're likely to be more effective. But I would say that unfortunately the history of actually reforming the governance structure of existing global institutions is not very encouraging.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's not a optimistic note, but probably very realistic one. Thank you. Nabil, you were mentioning and stressing the need for more cooperation in this phase. What's your view about how the relationship between the US and China will evolve? Do you think we'll go back to the trade war, which has been somehow suspended in the past months? In trade, the war has been suspended, not in other areas. But what do you think? Do you think we'll be back to difficult relation, or the need for cooperation will prevail?
Thank you, Lucia, for a great question. I'm waiting for your question on U.S.-China relation. Actually, I know you will mention this because this is maybe one of the core issue of our global governance right now, the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China. But first of all, I would like to give some feedback to Professor Horney. And I totally agree with you. Actually, if we would like to innovate the reform of the multilateralism or the multilateral organization, maybe we can invite more stakeholders from the private sector and some NGOs, some we call it global NGO, those private sector stakeholder to engage to the reform of those international organizations. Maybe it's a new path or option to reform, to engage those existing international cooperation mechanism, maybe bring the new ideas to them. And you mentioned the plastic ocean, anti-plastic ocean, ocean plastic. I remember last time I went to the WTO annual conference in European countries. My Center for China and Globalization initiated as just a private think tank, initiated a conference on the anti-ocean plastic. Many ambassadors from different countries to WTO participated. We have consensus to how to we should have some global cooperation on the anti-plastic ocean. So that is a new path to reform different international organization. And another issue is that U.S.-China relation. Of course, we know before the pandemic, U.S.-China reached the phase 1 trade agreement, has put things on more steady footing. And given the stakes at hand, both sides have compelling reasons to put aside their differences and work together. This would also help set the tone for a more concerned global response to global challenges, including the pandemic. But and the reality is opposite. We find from the U.S.-China relation, from the trade conflict, trade war, to the blame game. That is bad. That is not. There's no beneficiary from the blame game. This would. I think in the future, no matter how eager U.S. or China are to see the new, some people in those countries see a new round of Cold War, healing the wounds caused by pandemic and summarizing experience to improve cooperative response to for the next crisis should remain the main theme for the U.S. and China. I should mention that there are some Western media who blame China on taking advantage while providing assistance or aid to seek geopolitical ambitions. But we should know that in 2008, U.S. definitely played a major role to resume the global economy in G20 efforts. While this time there is no mechanism and public goods. After pandemic, we see the performance of U.S. in the international stage. So the humanitarian assistance should be not treated as a political instruments. This is my core, the key point. But I believe the people-to-people exchange and the business community should be the key factor to bridge two countries and keep the peace and the prosperity for the whole world. So my center as a private sector think tank, we would like to bridge the international business community in Beijing and encourage the people-to-people exchange between U.S. and China, and moving our bilateral relationship forward more healthy. So this is my points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mabel. I think it's very interesting because we've heard from the different speakers that in one way we had a much larger role for the state and the governments during the crisis, but at the same time also we had different speakers stressing the importance of private cooperation, of the private sector in rebuilding the way in which globalization will develop in the aftermath. So we have this dual paths ahead of us. I think it's very interesting. So let me try to wrap up with a very quick question open to all the speakers that goes back to the initial point I was making at the beginning. Hopefully we'll be out of the health crisis in a few months, hopefully, and will we face a new world, a new normal, a new globalization, or do you expect we will be back to the old normal to 2019 or 2018? What is your expectations? We'll go in reverse order this time. Mabel, so a quick word on this. What's your expectation? A new world or back to the old?
And actually, for me, I'm still looking forward to the health and peaceful international relations, especially the U.S. and China relation. The two major powers should pay more attention and take more responsible on the global new globalization and return the healthy globalization. We should contribute more to the G20 and the new style of international mechanism to innovate it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Homie, so do you think 2021 or 22 will be business as usual? What do you think?
Well, what I want is for it to be a new world and a new globalization, because quite evidently the way in which we were going about doing things in the old way was generating crisis upon crisis. And I don't believe that it's an accident that we've had a series of once in a century crises, and we continue to have them. After a while, if you believe in data, you have to stop saying this is a once in a century crisis. So we know we need something new. And what I would say is that the biggest new thing that we need is a globalization where the international exchange of ideas and information really starts to flow much better. We've talked a lot about, trade and value chains and whether those are going to get restructured. I think the really important area is not going to be trade in goods. It's going to be how information gets treated. And the new globalization, which is continuing unchecked, is a massive globalization about the exchange of data. So if you just look at terabits of data that are flowing across borders, that has been rising exponentially and continues to rise. But right now, without any real norms and standards to ensure it, and the real risk that we have with globalization today is that very old national security laws that permit all kinds of loopholes, should I say, in the WTO can be exploited to try to slow or even reverse that globalization of information, of exchange of ideas, and of innovation. Because the new world has to be a world of innovation in a number of different areas.
Thank you very much. Maria, from the European point of view, what do you think? A new Europe?
Well, that's perhaps too much. I actually agree with what Homi said entirely. I don't believe there was anything normal about the old normal if it's generating crisis this way. So the new normal needs to be really new. So in that respect, I think there are some practices that need to change. And I certainly believe that there is more than ever. I mean, there's always was the case, but now with the pandemic, there is an incredible need for global cooperation for what Mabel called a healthy globalization. I mean, I could not agree more with that. I think that's absolutely crucial. I fear, however, that on that front, we might not get to what we want. And Eric summarized it very nicely in his initial comments. I was reading a fascinating article by Larry Summers this weekend, and he talked about something. It was a fascinating article, a very reasonable article, very inspiring, but he used the word that, rather scared me. He talked about, and he's talked about this before, something called responsible nationalism. And that is an oxymoron, in my view. And to talk about a responsible nationalism reverberates very badly, certainly in Europe. Nationalism it's difficult to think of responsible nationalism in Europe. So, I mean, I think the tendency, we heard also from Eric, in the US will be not to cooperate, to look more inwards. Europe is looking very carefully to what it thinks about that. We don't have a clear view in Europe as to what that means or how we want to address it. And here, countries have got different views about different things. So, to find a common European case in this will be quite difficult. But I think it's crucial that we maintain global cooperation, and now more than ever.
Thank you very much. And Eric, same question to you. What will be the new normal, or would it be business as usual?
So I couldn't agree more with all of the very positive things that all the other panelists have said. So I'm not going to add any more positive weight. I think we have to change. It's absolutely vital. And I'll use my last few minutes just to make everybody feel horrible about what's going to happen over the next 18 months. And I gave that example of the Fukushima nuclear accident and the disruption of supply chain that one industrial district caused. What we're going to see as second wave outbreaks emerge are different parts of the global economy shutting down periodically, asynchronously, over a long period of time until we get some control over this. And more than anything else, that's going to disrupt our ability to rebuild the old supply chains. Because we're constantly going to have to be resourcing some component that we never thought we would have to resource before. We all remember what it was like to see that hand sanitizer disappear from the shelves, right? How complicated is that to make? And the answer is not very, but the supply chains are very tightly organized. So any loss of any component is a source of disruption. We have to get through that. And once we get through that, we're going to have to find a way to extract the public sector from the private sector. Again, I thought Maria's point about state aid was absolutely vital, but competition policy is not just about competition within Europe, it's about competition at the global level as well. And we're going to find a lot of public sector investment in private sector activity in countries that are not used to being exposed in that way, and getting that extracted is going to be complicated. So we've got so many problems that we're going to have to face. At the end of this, we're going to have to be immensely creative. And I think ISPI and I think all my co-panelists, this is the kind of exchange that Homi was talking about that I think we're going to have to see in the future. And it's going to have to be repeated on a very frequent, almost routinized basis for us to get out of this.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you also for this last suggestion. I really think that this was a very, very inspiring panel, and we really had very, very interesting discussion in my view. And I hope this was the same for our audience. And I really hope that we could repeat on a regular basis this type of experience. I totally agree with what was said by all of you. The only way out is by exchanging ideas, cooperating. So we really think that, I guess, this is part of the task of our institutions and of our job. So I really hope that we will have soon a chance to do this again. Let me thank you really warmly again for participating to this panel, and best wishes to all of you, and in touch soon. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lucia.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.